You're telling me you're surprised that I'd make a dungeon video as soon as I make my return? Must be new to the channel. Echoes of Wisdom came out months ago now. Took me about a month to finish the game, and then I decided to give it a while before I started talking more about some spoilers in the game. Well, just as I did with Tears of the Kingdom, it's time to delve into each dungeon, do a short analysis on my thoughts on each one, and then give them a little ranking out of 10 compared to the other top-down dungeons in the series. Echoes of Wisdom was a huge deal for the fanbase, as I highlighted in my last video. The lore ended up being better than anything we've had in the last few years in the end. No shots at Tears of the Kingdom, I love that game. And the dungeons are kinda traditional, I'd say more so than the last couple of new dungeon sets that we've had anyway. So let's get into it, from the first to the final dungeon in the game. Obviously, spoiler warning for Echoes of Wisdom. Time to kick off the return. And let me say, I think there's a ranking or two in here that may surprise you. Suthorn Ruins. The first area you're allowed to explore and the first dungeon you're greeted to in this game. It's pretty bare bones. For me, this one had the most magic going in purely because I was excited to see how they'd handle these dungeons. That being said, it's cool to fight Echo Link pretty much straight away. He drops his sword and that basically opens up most of the rest of the game. This area as a whole absolutely still suffers from the first dungeonitis that plagues almost every Zelda title. Theme-wise, a good portion of the dungeons that we're talking today are pretty bare bones. Echoes of Wisdom doesn't really push the boat out on general themes, but this is probably the least aesthetically pleasing to walk around. There's no defining feature except the whole ruin theme, which is still usually a part of the rest of these dungeons anyway. The puzzles are fine. Initially I thought they were pretty cool, but that's just because it was the first time using the new features established in this game. Revisiting it, it's much easier to see that it's not the best. Another part of that is the still world section before it. On a first run through, it's really cool to see the still world, especially after the trailers teasing it, but unlike a few later dungeons, I don't think it raises the experience by too much on subsequent playthroughs either. Seismic Talus, right? Oh, that fella. He's a boss. Definitely a boss. Probably the worst in the game in my opinion. That speaks more to the quality of the bosses in this roster than it does to how bad the Talus is though. They're pretty average when compared to the rest of the series. A pretty fine dungeon overall, but realistically it's a 4 out of 10 I'd say. Pretty standard, but more under par than over. Gerudo Sanctum was the next one I made my way to. Spoiler alert, this is one of my favourites in the entire game. Is it a top tier dungeon in this series? Well, an argument could absolutely be made, but I don't think so. Its theming is very good, so already atmospherically it's winning some points, but I also think this is the one dungeon in the first set of 3 that gets puzzling just right. The dungeon quest before it is quite the trip. Sealing up different risks to the still world to save different inhabitants of Gerudo Town is a nice little task, and since I'm kinda including the still world sections into the dungeons themselves, I think the little still world bit you do find in 5 of Tri's friends is maybe the best still world section of the game. At the very least, it's the best for really honing your skills and starting to figure out how you want to play the game, because you can use flying creatures to fly around yourself. I mean, I used one of those guys to get me up to one of Tri's friends and it was a damn good time. Similarly though, you could have just used spiders instead. It's really cool. Into the dungeon itself, I think this is the one where I started to have real hope for how the rest of these areas could look and play like. Gerudo Sanctum is a giant sandbox of all the stuff that the Zelda team have been kinda unsuccessful doing in the temples in Tears of the Kingdom and the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild. Going outside, finding new ways into the Sanctum to puzzle your way to the end, all whilst having little mini puzzles throughout. Gerudo Sanctum asks you to solve it like a little puzzle box rather than solving every little puzzle and just calling it a day. That mixed with the atmosphere bumps it up a good few spots by itself. Add in some good music, and it's a nice vibe. The boss isn't one of the best in the game, so I'll have to dock a point for that. Mogriff isn't bad by any means, just forgettable compared to the rest. As usual, desert temples in Zelda games will reign supreme. That being said, there is another dungeon on this list I actually prefer, but we'll get into that. Based on the full experience with the Still World section, I have to admit that I really thought this would be my top pick about halfway through the game, but it just misses out. I will happily give it an 8.5 out of 10 though. Despite all the good stuff I said about it, there is an unexplainable force that doesn't allow me to like it quite as much as I actually want to. Give it another couple of weeks and I could whack it in as a 9 out of 10 though, so it's variable. Jabul Ruins next. I'd heard some pretty mixed things around this dungeon since it had already been a week since it released when I came around to the ruins, and yeah, I can't lie, this is the one that might surprise you. Now, is it better than Gerudo Sanctum? Not in my humble opinion, but I do not think it's awful. Now, saying that, it's very hard to ignore the fact that there is a ridiculously easy way to basically just skip the entire area if you want to. Pop down a couple water blocks, get yourself the boss key, and then you can be done if you want to. Will I knock a point off for it? Honestly, yeah, I probably will. It is a fundamental design issue, so I kinda have to punish it. Back to still world sections, there's a couple here and they're really cool. I didn't have as much fun as the Gerudo one, but the water block is a very cool addition and teaches about your entire future in Echoes of Wisdom, using the water block to get basically anywhere. These ruins don't have the most insane puzzles, but they challenge your brain a tiny bit. Theming wise, I think it's also pretty good. I love myself a bit of a water temple vibe, and there's a little bit of that, with the tiniest aspect of a rising water level. Let's assume I didn't cheese the dungeon, which I didn't, and I just enjoyed this one more than I thought I would, truly. Maybe I have a weird bias to water temples outside of Tears of the Kingdom these days, but I also thought this dungeon is the one that did terminals better than most of the temples in Tears and Breath of the Wild. So for that, I think that's a win. Vocavor is actually kind of a banging boss in my eyes too, so Jabul Ruins I think is a solid 6 out of 10. As I've said during this, it's pretty good, nothing more. Arguably you could say something less. Time for a shorter one now. Hyrule Castle had a very good setup and it opened up the rest of the game, which on average is definitely better than the first half of the game and starts a big train of lore that doesn't stop until the credits roll. That being said, I think that this Hyrule Castle is pretty much the definition of what the kids would say is mid. I think some of the good parts of previous versions of Hyrule Castle is making me rate this one lower than I should, but I just wasn't that impressed outside of the boss and some cool theming bits. I actually have way less to talk about with this one than I thought, just underwhelming, and because of the Hyrule Castle name, I feel like I have to get rid of a point for that too. 3 out of 10 for the newest variation of the castle. Let's hope the next one's better. Faron Temple is an out-and-out, near-perfect dungeon with the new gameplay style in my eyes. It has you venturing inside and outside of the main building, taking trips around the building itself, ensuring that you haven't forgot something. Something a lot of these games in recent years have lacked is keys being harder to find. The keys are a reason why some people find Ocarina of Time's Water Temple and Forest Temple hard. In some ways, a temple being hard isn't always a good thing. I love the Water Temple, but plenty of people hate its guts. But I think the Faron Temple in Echoes of Wisdom might be the most perfect placement for the difficulty of a dungeon since Link Between Worlds, honestly. It's definitely not too easy in my opinion, and not too hard. Maybe you guys will disagree, but that's where I stand on it. I think there is some degree of magic here too. If you guys have been around the channel for a while, then you'll know that I always had a dream of a dungeon in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom that you could just walk into. It'd be like a Forest Temple type of vibe from Ocarina of Time. In a small way, Faron Temple has kinda fulfilled my dream. I know in reality it's basically just a jungle temple, but that does mean something after so long waiting for another temple like this. Music wise, it's not as ambient as the Forest Temple of old. It's got a more whimsical vibe than I expected or really wanted. The music's fine, but outside of a couple instruments, I don't think it elevates the experience too much. The boss is Goma too, probably one of my favourite bosses in the game. Finally, a Goma boss has fulfilled their potential, truly an epic fight. I do have to personally bump it down for a couple of its water puzzles in these side-scrolling sections. I just don't think they're as cool as they could have or maybe even should have been. Everything altogether comes to a 9 out of 10 in my eyes, and the best dungeon in the game in my opinion. I'm a big Lightning Temple lover from Tears of the Kingdom, so if I'm ranking Faron Temple against that, I'd honestly probably put them on the same pedestal, but it could fluctuate daily. Eldin Temple. First things first, the music in this area actually does enhance the experience. Hear me out. I know I literally just said that Faron Temple's music was whimsical and didn't really elevate the vibe, and this track is even more of the same, but because of the plotline going into this dungeon with Darstan, he had a compelling little quest, but at the end of the day, the guy is still just a little goofball, and that vibe carries into Eldin Temple. All of this being said, I don't have a whole lot of positives to pile onto Eldin Temple. There's a few too many puzzles that are just a little bit simplistic. This feels like the dungeon you should do right after the Hyrule Castle midway point of the game to me. It's not a bad dungeon by any means. Actually, in a lot of ways, it falls into the same pattern that Hyrule Castle did. It's just kinda bland. Maybe some of you will disagree, but I'm sorry, I just didn't love my time with this dungeon. This being said, the boss is really cool, being the return of Volvagia in the series for the first time since Ocarina of Time, and it's a compelling boss fight. It's on the upper end of bosses in the game, for sure. The only real standout moment in here for me is the section where lava's chasing you out of a hole after getting the boss key. That's just really cool. It's a good dungeon for sure, but I don't know. Overall, it just didn't do it for me. In a lot of ways, it reminded me of Fire Temple in Tears of the Kingdom. I enjoyed it, but with Fire Temple, I felt like there was a way I could enjoy it more with time. With Eldin Temple, I feel like it will just become easier with time. I'm not entirely sure if that sounded harsh, but I don't mean it to. I give Eldin Temple a 5 out of 10, whereas Hyrule Castle was branded mid but had the name of Hyrule Castle to live up to. Eldin Temple is in that exact meh position. You know, you don't really feel much about it, it's just meh. I won't hate going back, but I won't look forward to it. Lanayru Temple. Okay, here's where things are going to get interesting again. Much like the Faron Temple, before getting up to the end of the game, I'd heard a lot of people heap praise onto this one, but I'd also heard a bit of mixed too. It seemed like a lot of people's favourite dungeon was either this or Faron. I fall into the latter camp, but not by too far at all. First of all, I think probably the only thing I personally think Lanaeru does better is the music. Lanayru Temple might just be my favourite track in the entire game. Beautifully atmospheric whilst still brimming with life and keeping with the instruments that make sense for the ice caverns surrounding the mountain. It's a delight to just listen to the music, truth be told. It has that distinct twinkling effect that so many of the best Zelda songs seem to have. Puzzle-wise, I think this dungeon is probably the hardest in the game. I had more problems with individual puzzles here than I did with anything else in this version of Hyrule. Then again, there were some times where I was just kind of being dumb. The boss for this dungeon is Scorcho, the only original boss in the latter 3 dungeons before the end, and they're pretty good. What I've learnt making this video is that the bosses are pretty top tier in the series, every single one of them, so while I think this boss is pretty meh when compared to the others in this game, Scorcho ranks pretty high against the rest of the series, I think, especially the top-down games. There's quite a bit of combat in general in this dungeon. I enjoy the vibe, the boss is pretty cool, I think the puzzles are tough but fair all in all. It is a great dungeon, while I think Faron Temple is a fantastic dungeon. Lanayru Temple doesn't quite reach the heights of Faron due to it not having such a sprawling nature, even going as far as leading you outside of the main building as seen at Faron Temple. I know I'm saying the names a lot. I think with time I'll probably grow to love Lanayru Temple even more, but since we're not a few playthroughs strong to the game yet, I think I have to stop and just give this temple an 8 out of 10. The 3rd best temple in the game with potential to go first pretty much at any time still. Null's Body, the big epic climax of the game. My rating of this dungeon comes largely down to what precedes it in the still world, and the fact that you have Link kinda travelling with you, but also kinda not. He fights and then he pieces out, rinse and repeat. Part of this rating is also down to the general theme. It's really cool to see an original theme in a game that's pretty devoid of anything outside of water, rock, lava, snow, forest. It's a welcome addition, even if the dungeon aspect leaves a lot to be desired, considering the game it's in and the pretty cool lead up to the area, and also considering that the final boss fight is awesome and also feels like it has more stakes than most fights in the entire series. It definitely gets a point for those things. I really don't think it's an unreasonable rating to give this one a 2 out of 10 for the dungeon itself, despite a cool theme, a cool couple fighting sections, the boss fight. That's really all that's here. So, in conclusion, let's have a look at my ranking. The bottom of the pack is Null's Body with a 2 out of 10, next up is Hyrule Castle with a 3 out of 10, then Suthorn Ruins with a 4 out of 10, next is Eldin Temple with a middle of the road 5 out of 10, and then Jabul Ruins at a surprising 6 out of 10, moving on to Lanayru Temple hitting an 8 out of 10, then Gerudo Sanctum narrowly ahead of that with an 8.5, and finally the victor of the game, Faron Temple. It sits at a 9, but could go to a 9.5 with time. There's a lot of things here that are very variable, they could change. Overall, the dungeons in this game are solid in my opinion. There are very high highs, but some pretty low lows. Definitely not the best dungeon set in any Zelda title, probably not even in the top-down games. The best overall still sits with Twilight Princess in my eyes, but a damn good set, and I feel like they're a little underrated by the community at the minute, weirdly enough. I think dungeons at the minute are at least heading in the right direction. Comment below your ranking of all the main dungeons in this game. Please do like and subscribe, and a huge thank you to my patrons, especially all of these guys for sticking with me for the last year. Videos are really back on track this time, and I can't wait to start making content for you again.